We've been in the Gospel of John now for a long time, and we're nearing the end. And today I want to talk about the trial. The trial is in John chapter 18, verses 12 on through part of chapter 19. We'll do quite a bit of reading. And as you know, if you've been watching any of the videos that I record, I really try to hit hard on practical application. But sometimes we just have to stop and we just have to look at the biblical text and take it for what it is, even if there's not a lot of application. And when it comes to the trial of Jesus, there's some things in here I want you to see that I hope help you, but it's not necessarily going to be the most practical lesson that you're going to take from Embark Ministries. But I want to show you some things that I think will help you understand better the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we're in John's Gospel. We're in chapter 18. We're going to begin in verse 12, and I'm going to read a couple of sections of Scripture, and then I'm going to give you some context. It says, "Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people." Down in verse 19. "Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. 'I have spoken openly to the world,' Jesus replied. 'I've always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said.' When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. 'Is this the way you answer the high priest?' he demanded. 'If I said something wrong,' Jesus replied, "testify as to what it is. But if I speak the truth, why did you strike me?' Then Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas, the high priest." Now, let me give you a little bit of background and the players involved. The Roman Empire ruled most of the known world at that time. Israel was under the Roman Empire. They were basically slaves. They were a slave state to the Roman Empire. And the government basically said to the Israelite people, we will leave you alone and let you more or less govern yourselves unless you have a rebellion against us. And if you have a rebellion against us, we're going to kill your leaders. We're going to hang the leaders of the rebellions on a cross to show you not to mess with us. And the more that you rebel, the less peace there is in Israel, the more we're going to come in and we're going to enforce the Roman will on you, even to the point they always threaten them, we'll take over your temple. And when we take your temple, you're going to lose your religion. Annas and Caiaphas were basically the two Jews in Jewish leadership that were to answer to Rome for how Israel was behaving as a country. And so Annas and Caiaphas were responsible, more or less from the Jewish perspective, to make sure that there was peace in the land. That's why Caiaphas in John chapter 11, when he was talking to the Sanhedrin, said, look, this Jesus is dividing our nation. A lot of people are for him, a lot of people are against him. He's dividing us. It's better for one man to die for the nation than for us all to end up under the mercy of the hand of Rome, because you know Rome has no mercy and they're going to come down hard on us. And so that is why Annas and Caiaphas are so involved and have to have Jesus killed in their minds because of this situation with the Roman government. But as you know, and we've talked about a lot in this series, there was a whole lot of other reasons. One, there was unfulfilled expectations. They had this expectation that they wanted basically a physical Messiah that was going to rise up and lead an army in rebellion against Rome. They would take care of Rome. They would push Rome out of the country, and then that Messiah would set up a physical throne in Jerusalem, and he would lead a physical kingdom. Jesus, that is not who he was. He was a spiritual Messiah building a spiritual kingdom. And so there was a lot of unmet expectations with regard to that. And second thing, you have the whole idea of power and authority and money, where the Jewish leaders, and Caiaphas and Annas were certainly the two that were leading the leaders of the country. Their monetary situation was threatened. They were threatened politically. They were threatened with their authority, with their power, because everything in Jewish life ran through the temple. Economics ran through the temple. The social life of the people ran through the temple. The spiritual life of the people ran through the temple. Everything in society ran through the temple, and Jesus threatened the temple. Remember, earlier that week, he had turned over the tables in the temple courts and run all the sellers out. That cost those religious leaders hundreds of thousands of dollars, the equivalent of that, in money right there. And so they needed Jesus out of the way because they wanted their power and control base back. They wanted to control the people through the temple. They wanted their financial base back, and they didn't want any trouble with Rome. And so in their minds, the only way out is to get Jesus killed. Now, here's the problem. The way the Roman government had the system set up is they could only try someone and find them and imprison them. They could not kill anyone. And so the only way they could get Jesus killed is Pilate had to come in and order the crucifixion. That's the only way the Jews could crucify Jesus. And yet it was Passover, and yet Sabbath was coming, and it's Thursday night, late Friday morning early, and they've got to get Jesus on a cross. And so here's what they did. They have this trial, and I just read you parts of that trial. In the middle of the night, from about 1 to 6 in the morning, they have this Jewish trial. They had to condemn Jesus and then convince Pilate he was a criminal and get him on the cross on Friday so they could have Jesus dead before the Sabbath and before the Passover. So because of that, Annas and Caiaphas, they had a complete illegal mock trial. And I just want to read you a couple of things here that tell you about that trial. First of all, it was an illegal arrest because according to Jewish law, you could not arrest a criminal at night. When did they arrest Jesus? Somewhere around midnight, Thursday night, Friday morning. It was an illegal trial because it was forbidden by Jewish law to have a trial at night. When did they have this trial? 1 to 6 in the morning. It was an illegal trial because it was forbidden to have a trial during a Jewish feast. This was during the week of the Passover feast. It was an illegal trial because the high priest was not allowed to be the prosecutor in a trial. And yet, what did you see? The high priest, Caiaphas, was the one that was the prosecutor in the trial. It was an illegal trial because the high priest was not allowed to question the accused. And yet, here is Caiaphas questioning Jesus. And so we had this illegal trial. In so many ways, this was a mistrial. In so many ways, there's no way they could pull this off. Everything they did was illegal that night. It's interesting to have a valid trial in the Jewish court system. You had to have 2 witnesses that had identical stories about what they saw with a criminal in order to get an arrest. And so what they did is they had 2 witnesses corroborate their lies to make sure they were identical so that they could actually arrest Jesus and have him tried and found guilty. That's why Jesus says, why are you asking me about this? Why don't you ask your false witnesses you've set up against me? They're the ones that made up the story. That's what Jesus was talking about in the midst of that trial. That's why they slapped his face and said, how dare you talk to Caiaphas that way? But Jesus was pointing out that they were making the whole thing up and lying. They were lying about the entire thing to get the false accusations against him because why? They had to get Jesus killed, and the only way they could get Jesus killed in a Roman court of law is for Jesus to be seen as an insurrectionist, someone leading a rebellion against Rome. That's the only way that Rome would kill him. And so they had these false witnesses to claim that that's what Jesus was doing so that Pilate would agree to hang Jesus on a cross. And so the whole thing was an illegal trial based on lies of made-up testimony of people that Annas and Caiaphas had set up to do that. It's interesting to me to listen to the hypocrisy because they're lying to set up a murder, and yet here's what it says in 1828. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. This is now 6 a.m. Friday morning. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So in other words, they're willing to lie and murder someone they don't like, but they're not willing to enter the palace because they don't want to be ceremonially unclean to eat their Passover. That shows you the hypocrisy and the blindness and the hard-heartedness of the Jewish leaders as they are trying to get Jesus on a cross. So that's kind of the Jewish side of the trial that went on. John doesn't talk a lot about that. We get some more of that in the other Gospels that obviously we're not going to talk about today. So now I really want to focus on now Pilate's part, because what you're going to see in Pilate is we're going to see that Pilate is put in a no-win situation. And so what he does is he goes through this slow fade. Pilate is scared to death of Rome, and he's scared to death of Annas and Caiaphas. And here's why. Pilate had been demoted by Rome. He was in Israel. This was his last stop. And if he didn't keep Israel under control, not only was his job on the line, but his neck was on the line. And he knew that, and Annas and Caiaphas knew that, and used that as leverage against Pilate, because Pilate could not afford a mess up in Israel, or Pilate's head was on the line. So he's scared of the Jewish leaders on that side, and he knew their leverage against him, and yet he's scared of Jesus on the other side. I want to read to you something here in John chapter 19, beginning in verse 7. It says, "The Jews insisted, 'We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God.'" So what they're saying to Pilate is, let me tell you why you have to kill him. You have to kill him because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Now, he's more afraid than what? Well, obviously, because he's more afraid, that meant he was afraid before. What was he afraid before of? He was afraid of Annas and Caiaphas and them, quote, telling on him to the emperor, and him being, at best, kicked out, and at worst, killed because of his inability to control Israel. But he's more afraid, and here's why. And here's what it says. He said he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who has handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Pilate was even more scared of Jesus because, remember, he believed in Greek mythology, Roman mythology. And so when they said the Son of God, that meant one thing to the Jews, but what it meant to Pilate was Jesus could be a son of one of the Greek gods. So here's Pilate's dilemma. If Jesus really is one of the sons of the Greek gods, and I kill him, the Greek gods are going to come back and take revenge on me and destroy me. On the other side, I'm scared to death of Rome. If Rome finds out that I have let this guy go free, and Annas and Caiaphas tell on me, and supposedly an insurrectionist or someone in rebellion against Rome is not being killed under my rule, well, then Rome's going to come after me. So Pilate's in a no-win situation. He has no way out. And so what I want you to notice here as we read through this is I want to show you how Pilate retreats back in making his decision about Jesus. So we're going to begin in verse 29 of chapter 18. It says this. "So Pilate came out to them and asked, 'What charges are you bringing against this man,' against Jesus? 'If he were not a criminal,' they replied, 'we would not have handed him over to you.'" In other words, what did the Jews say? "We're not answering your question. We're just telling you he's a criminal and he needs to die." Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." So in other words, the first thing Pilate does, at first, Pilate stands pretty firm for his convictions. This has nothing to do with Rome. You're making up bogus charges. I know you are. You know you are. You know this has been an illegal mock trial all night long. You have no basis for this. I think he's innocent. You just go take care of him in your own court system and leave me out of this. And he said, but they say, "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews' objective. See, they want him dead and they don't have the right to do that. This happened so that the words of Jesus had spoken indicating the kind of death he was going to die would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" In other words, Pilate's like, I don't care about this whole situation. It doesn't matter to me, but they've handed you over and I'm going to have to render a decision. Defend yourself here, Jesus. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." So you are a king then. Pilate said. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying that I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. And with this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." So the first thing Pilate does is he stands for his conviction. And he says, this man is innocent. I find no basis for a charge against this man. He shouldn't even be in the Roman court system. You need to be handling this on your own. This whole phrase, and it's interesting, he says, what is truth? I almost feel like Pilate is kind of shaking his head going, there's no truth in this situation at all. You've made up the accusations against him. You've given a bogus trial. This is a ridiculous situation. He's innocent. Take care of this yourself. So that's Pilate's first stance. But watch what happens. Because the Jews have kept pushing him over and over, Pilate goes to a next level, and that is he wants to bargain. So he says this, "I find no basis for a charge against him. However, it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Now, I can't surmise what Pilate is thinking, but here's what I wonder. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent. He knows it's a bogus trial. He's already declared twice, this man is innocent. You need to take care of it yourself. The Jews are pushing him, the Jewish leaders, no, he's got to be killed. So he says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bargain with them. I'm going to put Jesus, a pretend insurrectionist that they're claiming he is and he's not, up against a real scoundrel. Barabbas was a real insurrectionist. He was going to die on a cross for leading a rebellion against Rome. He was going to die on a cross for being a murderer. And it's like Pilate says, okay, look at Jesus, and now look at Barabbas. Which one do you want? One is a real scoundrel, and one is just a guy you're mad at. Surely when you see the truth and you say, okay, this guy's this way and Jesus is really innocent, you're going to choose to let Jesus go free. What Pilate didn't understand was how badly the Jewish leaders needed Jesus gone. They wanted him dead, and they chose Barabbas to be set free. So Pilate was trying to bargain, but it backfired on Pilate. So next, he decides to punish Jesus. So let's begin in John 19, beginning in verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is your man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." First thing Pilate did, he tried to stand up and say, this is a Jewish matter. Don't get Rome involved. Second thing he tried to do is bargain. Look, I'll give you Barabbas versus Jesus. Surely you'll choose Jesus. They chose Barabbas. Now, he decides to punish Jesus. Now, when it says that word scourge, what that means is they took a whip in those days, and they put little pieces of metal and nails and rock, and they would put that in the whip so that when they whipped someone with it, the metal would attach to their flesh, and when they would pull back the whip, it would just rip open their flesh. And by Roman law, they could only beat someone with a whip 39 times because they found that 40 and over, the person would usually die. At 39, it ripped the back up and left the back looking like hamburger meat with the muscles exposed, but it never really got to any internal organs or caused enough bleeding to cause death. Unbelievably painful. And that's what Pilate did. Pilate believed Jesus is innocent. Twice in 19:1-6, he says, "This man is innocent. I find no basis for a charge. But to pacify you Jews, so that you'll feel like there's a punishment and he got your justice, I'm going to beat him within an inch of his life." And so Jesus comes back out with this crown of thorns on his head, and you know that those thorns were about 1.5 inches long, in his scalp, blood running off his scalp. beaten to a pulp on his back where his whole back is exposed, and they've got that robe around him, mocking him. And he says, look, here's what I've done. I've beaten this guy almost to death. Isn't that enough for you? Once again, Pilate is trying to not kill Jesus and yet placate the Jews. He's playing both of these against each other to try to get out of it. But what he didn't understand about the Jews is they were like wolves. As soon as they saw the blood, that wasn't enough. They just wanted to devour him. And so they yell, crucify him, crucify him. And that leads us to the last thing that Pilate does, and that is he simply washes his hands of the situation. So let's pick up the reading now in verse 12. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. What are they doing to Pilate? If you don't kill Jesus, we're telling Caesar, and you're done. It's exactly what they're saying to Pilate. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Arabic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. Here is your king, Pilate said to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king, Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, said the chief priests. Once again, putting that back on Pilate. Finally, Pilate handed them over to be crucified. Here's what I want you to know. Pilate knew he was in a no-win situation. And so here's what he says. Matthew's gospel records that he actually got water and he washed his hands. And he says, you know what? I'm not making a decision. I am not going to be responsible for killing a possible son of a Greek god and have the Greek gods come after me. I'm also not going to not kill Jesus and have you turn me in. So you know what? I'm washing my hands. I'm not responsible. I'm done. You take him. You do with him what you want. And of course, what we know from that trial and Pilate's decision is that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Now, here's my one point today I want to leave with you. In Pilate's mind, he didn't make a decision. Pilate's no decision was the biggest no decision in history. But was his no decision a decision? Did he really wash his hands and have no consequences because he didn't make a decision? No. His no decision was a decision. And here's what I want you to hear today. If you happen to be watching this and you don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ because you just don't want to make that decision, I want you to know that you've already made your decision. No decision about Jesus is a decision against Jesus. No decision is always a no. So if you have a situation and you say, I'm not going to make a decision on that, you've just made your decision. The decision is no. It's true with your relationship with Jesus Christ and spiritual things. It's true in your marriage. If you say, you know what, I'm not sure I want to go to counseling, I'm just not going to make a decision on that right now. You just made your decision. No counseling and probably no marriage. And if you're trying to make a decision at your job and you just say, you know what, I just don't know what decision to make. I'm just not going to make a decision right now. You just made a decision. Your no decision was a decision for no. Now, I'm not talking about running in and making rash decisions. Of course we pray and we wait on God and we listen to God. But I want you to know that God is a God of action. And that when we realize what God wants us to do, we are to act on that. And I have seen businesses break up and bankruptcies occur and marriages end and lives taken because men weren't willing to make a decision, thinking that no decision meant there were no consequences. But every time we make a no decision, we're just like Pilate. The no decision is a no. And the no decision can have huge consequences for the rest of your life. So here's what I want you to think about today as we wrap this up. What areas of your life are you making no decisions? What areas of your life are you deciding not to decide? And I want you to talk about that if you're in a group. I want you to pray about that and think about that if you're watching this alone. There's going to be a couple of questions come up on the screen for you to answer. But I want you to think about it. What are you doing with your no decisions? Because your no decisions can have greater consequences than your decisions. In fact, I'll say this. Most of the time, people who are decision makers, even if 20 or 30% of their decisions are the wrong decisions, do more in life than the people who don't make decisions. Why? Because no decision is usually a result of what? Fear? Fear. Why did Pilate not make a decision? He was scared, right? So what does Satan try to do? He tries to bring in that fear. And that fear leads to indecision, and that indecision is ultimately a decision for no, which has dramatic impact on your life. So look at your heart. Look at your life. Where are you making your decisions? How are you making your decisions? Are you allowing fear to keep you in a place of indecision? And if so, why? So talk about it, pray about it. This day is yours. Let's close with a prayer. Father, help us to be men and women who make decisions for you, who are proactive in making decisions for our lives. Lord, please protect us from paralysis of fear that can lead us to the compromises of faith that happen when we make no decision. In Jesus' name, amen.